Hey pals, welcome back to the Nothing Ventured podcast. So if you're watching on YouTube, you'll see that we've mixed things up a little bit. We've changed the set, made it look a little bit different. I wanted to add some visual variety into the podcast. So trying out a few new things and hopefully you like it. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, then obviously you won't be able to see that. But hopefully the audio side of things is just as good as well. So this episode is going to be all about pricing. Now, I've had a lot of questions since my original podcast episode, all about pricing and how to actually, package specific services and, everything to do with my freelance work as well. So hopefully this will serve as a place where I can just point people to, and if they have any questions after that, then they can come back. But yeah, it's just nice to be able to say to people, hey, look, I've already covered this. Listen to the podcast. Hopefully that will answer everything that you had, to ask, and we'll take it from there. So we're going to run the intro now. There's quite a lot to this, and hopefully you'll enjoy. Yeah, hope everyone's good. I had a few really nice messages after my last episode, which was all about how to actually start a creative freelance business. But today we're going to tap into one of the subjects I briefly discussed on the episode, which is pricing. Now, pricing is just one of those things that, can't really be answered quickly. It's a really complex topic and obviously will differ based on your individual circumstances, but hopefully some of the things that I'll talk about today will clear up probably some of the more difficult questions. Thinking back to when I first started, I tried to imagine, the sort of questions that I had back then and, the areas that I struggle with most. And yeah, hopefully this episode will cover some of those things for you. But yeah, before we get into that, I just wanted to, just briefly touch base with everyone. Hope that everyone's doing well. If you are listening, it'd be great if you could let me know. So please leave me a message. I really do appreciate it. As I've said in previous episodes, the point of this isn't really to scale it into anything crazy. I just wanted a place where I could direct people, who may be in a similar position to where I was a few years ago when I was just starting out with freelancing, not really sure, what I was doing. To be honest, I still feel like that some days. But yeah, I just felt that some things needed more of a discussion than just, me replying to people in the DMs of Instagram. So hopefully people are finding value in this. That's ultimately the reason why I started the Nothing Ventured podcast. And hopefully it's all going well. So, if there's a situation that you found these podcasts have been helpful for, I would love to hear all about it. So yeah, definitely let me know if that's been the case. So let's get into pricing. Now, I get a lot of questions about this, and more often than not, it's quite specific. But I'm going to tap into a few different subjects within the pricing topic today, and hopefully that will cover some of the areas that I find I keep coming back to when people are asking me questions. What I will say, though, is obviously I can't be too specific when it comes to the numbers. I obviously have to be sensible with how much information I put out there because, I need to be competitive. I operate as a commercial entity, so, as much as I'd love to say these are the specific numbers that I operate within, I need to be conscious of my, commercial viability, and I need to make sure that I'm not putting too much information out there. So hopefully that makes sense. The first thing we're going to talk about today are the types of pricing models that are out there. And, if you are like me and you are providing a creative service, these are probably going to be the ones that are most relevant to you. But if you're offering a slightly different package or, you operate in a different field, then there may be other pricing models that are more applicable to the sorts of services that you're offering. But these are just the ones that I find myself sort of considering or have considered in the past, and I'm going to dive into them shortly. What I will say is if you are approached by a potential client, or vice versa, if you approach them and you're trying to sell to them, I wouldn't go in with your pricing straight away. The thing that I typically do first before I actually present my price to potential clients is I'll either hop on a call with them or I'll do my best to meet them in person. Obviously, that's difficult at the moment, and it has been difficult for a while, but it is starting to get easier. And the reason why I do that, there are two reasons. The reasons why I do that is because, first of all, I want to completely understand what problem I'm solving for that client. And more often than not, there's going to be some things that they haven't been that open and transparent about. And, it's your job to understand exactly what the project may look like further down the line. So, even though they're probably going to say in their initial communications, we want you to do this, more often than not, you're going to find that there were a few other things that they are after, or there's a potential to sort of sell as well. And it puts you in a much better position to actually create your pricing based on those conversations. The other thing, or the other reason, is that once those potential clients have actually taken the time to sit down with you, either on a call or in person, they're going to be much more invested in you as an option. And the likelihood is they're going to choose you over a competitor of yours or a different option purely based on the fact that they've already had that communication with you. And they'll feel like they've already gotten over the initial, awkward stages of like meeting a new person, right? And yeah, I find that that's really useful. So before you actually present your price to potential clients, I definitely recommend doing that. Obviously, in my experience, and my experience alone, that's worked out really well for me. And the other benefit is that, you get to actually present yourself as an individual and to actually prove that you are, a nice person, that you could be potentially easy to work with, that people will have an enjoyable experience with you. There's a lot of other benefits from that, but all of that could probably be saved for a episode in its own right, all to do with selling. So I'll leave it at that, and hopefully that will make sense to everyone who is listening. So let's talk about the different pricing models that you could potentially employ. The first one I'm going to talk about is time-based pricing model strategy. Okay, bit of a wordy one. But what I essentially mean by that is basing your pricing on either hours or days taken to complete a project. Now, there's a few advantages and disadvantages to each of these models, which I'm going to go through because you may not have considered them yourselves. But the first point I wanted to make about this specific pricing model is that you need to establish which of those options is better for you. Now, for me personally, I much prefer daily billing as opposed to hourly because it's very easy to package daily billing compared to hourly. At least I think so. And the other reason is that there's a risk of almost, I don't know, I don't want to say it puts you at a disadvantage, but it can definitely punish you for being too efficient when it comes to hourly billing. Now, in an ideal world, we would all be able to complete things in the right amount of time. But the reality is, every time you find something that improves your processes or makes you more efficient, that's going to be less time that you can bill a client. And if you're constantly adjusting your rates based on that, the client's probably going to get a little bit frustrated at that. And it's not going to be the easiest sell when you go back to them and say, oh, my rate has changed since then. So I don't love hourly just for that reason, but it can also apply to daily billing as well. But the benefit of daily billing is that if you find that you've taken less time to actually complete something than you initially forecasted, it's a little bit easier with daily billing to say to the client, hey, I thought it was going to take us 3 days, for example. It actually only took us 2.5. Why don't I also include this deliverable, whatever that may be, and we can stick to our initially proposed budget. It's probably much more likely that that client's going to say yes to that because they already in their head had an idea of how much it was going to cost. And the difference between the difference between a half day and a full day probably isn't going to feel like that much of a difference. Whereas with hourly, it'll just feel like you're trying to pad out your initial project or your initial scope, and it's just not going to come across that well. So I prefer daily just for that reason. The good thing about time-based pricing strategies, I'm going to get really bored of saying that all in one go, is that it's very easy to actually calculate how much a project could potentially be worth. as you become more well versed in providing services, you'll understand exactly how long it'll take to actually facilitate specific parts of what you actually provide in your service package. Because of that, you're going to find it very easy to estimate how much something should cost. So if someone was to approach me for a headline video with maybe some, photography assets to support that campaign, I know in my head that's probably going to be somewhere around 3 days, just based on previous projects that I've worked on. And you also have to consider communications with the client. So, all the initial sort of planning and, establishing the scope of the project, what deliverables you're actually going to offer them. All of that time needs to be accounted for. It's not just the shoot and the edit. And it's also the delivery of those final assets as well. So all of those things need to be accounted for, because, your time is worth something, and you shouldn't be punished for all of the back-end work that goes into providing the services that you do. The problem with time-based billing is that it pits your goals against the client. So what I mean by that is, for you, the best outcome is to take as long as possible, or to have as much work as possible from that client to make that bill or that invoice as large as possible. Now, the problem with that is that the client's always going to be finding ways to streamline your process, or to keep that bill, that invoice, as slim as possible. And they might try to make sacrifices in order to get you there. So, for example, if you say, why don't we shoot at this location, and it's quite far away, you're obviously billing for your time to travel. They may decide, we don't really want to use that for whatever reason, so instead we'll just do it at this location, which may not be, as much of a better option, as much of a good option even. Just an example, throw out there. Ultimately, you want to keep your interests aligned with the client. So this pricing model specifically may not be the best because of just that. The other issue or downside to this pricing strategy is that it's really difficult to actually scale as your schedule fills up, or you reach capacity. There is a ceiling, because there's only so many hours or days that you can potentially work in a given period. And once you reach that ceiling, it's going to be really difficult for you to scale the business much further, unless you look into potentially outsourcing work, through subcontracting, or potentially growing your team and then taking on more work in that way. It's going to be a really difficult situation for you. If you reach your capacity, unfortunately, you're going to have to adjust your rate to grow at that point, and you might find that you're turning down work because of that. So, it's a tough one, but worth considering. Absolutely. Cool. So the next pricing strategy is outcome-based. I keep looking over my shoulder because that's where my notes are, but hopefully that won't be too distracting to those who are watching. So outcome-based is effectively trying to base your pricing on performance. Now, some sectors, industry will lead or lend themselves better to this pricing strategy, usually in the form of e-commerce brands or something that is sold online, because it's really easy to measure the success of those campaigns or, content areas, especially through like social media, analytics, etc. So, it's really going to depend on the client. It's going to depend on what services that you're actually offering. But again, there are advantages and disadvantages to doing this. It's obviously going to be much easier to scale in this way, but that opportunity to earn is going to be very contingent on how much trust you actually have in the client. So are they actually going to be sharing the analytics on the back end with you, so that you can clearly see which revenues have been generated through specific activities online, for example. Is it clear when something comes through a specific channel, how much of that was actually generated through, the service that you provided, or is it shared through different services, for example? That's, a really difficult one to navigate, and it's going to take a lot of time to really, sit down with a client and understand exactly, how to best navigate those sorts of situations. It's not one that I've got too much experience with, but in specific sectors or industries, I know that it's a really viable option. I just haven't really explored it much within what I do because it's a difficult sell. It's really difficult for me to approach a client and say, I think that you're going to generate this much income, so therefore my fee is this. It's not to say it can't happen, but how do you measure that? How do you actually present that to a client in a way that makes sense to them and doesn't just make it look like you're trying to be greedy and, squeeze as much revenue out of them that you can? Difficult, right? So the benefit of that is obviously, it's a much easier to scale pricing strategy, but lots of things to consider there. Now, what I see a lot of people doing in what I do, which is content creation, specifically videography and photography based services, is a flat rate pricing structure. And that usually comes in the form of different packages that are sort of selling a set of deliverables, maybe a headline video with photography assets, and then maybe like supporting videos for things like Reels or Instagram stories, TikTok, etc. Now, that's a really good and viable method for a lot of people because it kind of combines the time-based and outcome-based pricing models to an extent, because you know exactly how much your product is worth to clients, and therefore you can establish your package rates based on that. So, for example, if you were providing branding services, that's going to be really important to the client. They're probably going to want to spend good money to make sure that that's done correctly. So therefore you can, inflate your rate to reflect that. That's, a really sensible way of approaching it. But the problem with that is that it doesn't lend to bespoke projects, and it may reduce your viability for specific clients if they don't feel that what you're providing aligns with what it is that they're actually looking for, that actually solves the problem that they have. Now, it's not to say it's a bad option, it's not at all, but for me, in what I do, I quite often have to design a more bespoke package anyway. It's very rare for two clients to have exactly the same set of deliverables. So it's difficult for me to really weigh in on this one too much because it's just not how I operate. I usually go for more of a time-based pricing structure anyway, but there are plenty of opportunities where this would work. And one of those is when you have a really clear-cut understanding of which deliverables you're going to be producing, especially if you're doing that over and over, if it's really consistent. I use the example of, a branding expert. And I think that one is a really good example because, for example, that might be a logo design. It might be a few revisions of that logo. It could be a font or, set of fonts for that client that they could then use along with a color palette. That's a really, consistent package that you would provide on a consistent basis to clients. So a flat rate would probably lend itself really well to that specific service. And the good thing about that is that it rewards efficiency. So if you're really quick with providing that work, then you have the ability to actually take on more of those projects, and you're not losing revenue based on how efficient you are in those specific projects. So it can work really well for specific creative, or not even creatives. It really depends on what you're selling, but that's a consideration that you need to make on how well these pricing models work for you and your problem solving or service, I guess. So yeah, all right, just a quick point, just because I spotted it. The good thing about flat rate is that it really reduces scope creep as well, which I find with time-based pricing happens a lot. It's quite often that clients will say, oh, well, do you think you could do this as well? And you obviously want to service people in the best way possible, but you have to consider your bottom line. And sometimes you'll have to say, sure, we can do that, but I'm going to charge this extra. With flat rate, because you've already established those deliverables, it's very easy to turn around to the client and say, the rate was based on the deliverables that we set out initially. So therefore, happy to do that, but I will have to charge an additional cost based on what it is that you're looking for. Okay, so those are the three pricing models that I typically find myself considering or talking about with fellow creatives, etc. But which of those you decide to employ will really depend on the service that you're providing, right? Now, I'm going to talk about the actual numbers now and what those packages might actually look like. I'm going to be using very ballpark figures based on my experience, and again, my experience alone, but there are a few considerations to take into account here. So the first one being location. I'm obviously based in the UK, and in the UK, we probably have a pretty high average day rate, or any of these rates compared to a lot of other countries, because we are an expensive country. We package our services in a way that is relevant to the audience here, which I would assume spends a much higher amount of their disposable income than other countries, has a much higher amount of disposable income compared to other countries too. But there are other considerations to be made there too. In the US, they obviously have to pay for health insurance. And if you are self-employed, then that's a cost that you're going to have to cover. So therefore, your rates need to account for that too. Now, when I was listening to podcasts when I first started out, the numbers that I was hearing didn't make sense to me, because I thought there's no way that they could charge that. That just wouldn't fly in the UK. But over time, I've realized that it's because they have so much more to pay for than we do here. We have a national health service. So therefore, that's a cost that we don't necessarily have to worry about too much. There are also, tax implications in specific countries that may be higher or lower based on where you are in the world. And yeah, there's just so many variables there that the rates that I talk about here just will not be applicable in other countries. So keep that in mind, when we're talking about everything here. It's also going to come down to experience. So if you're just starting out, it's pretty safe to say that you're going to charge less than someone who's been freelancing or working in a specific industry for 5 to 10 years. And also how good you are. If you're really shit hot at what you do and brands want to work with you, you can pretty much charge whatever you want, because, there's no selling involved there. You don't have to justify your rates to people. If people want to work with you that badly, they'll pay you anything. So those three things, if you consider those, make a huge difference to pricing overall, and ultimately will decide on how much you charge potential clients moving forward. So let's talk about rates themselves. Now, when I first started, I just had a single rate in mind, and that's pretty much what I charged everyone. But over time, I've actually developed 3 different types of rates. So I have a lowest rate, the middle rate, and then my highest rate. And those are tailored to specific audiences. My lowest rate is more or less like a family and friends discounted rate, but the consideration there is that I operate on an opportunity cost. So if I'm doing lots of those projects for family and friends and I'm charging my lowest rate, that's my time, and it means that I can't service other clients that would potentially be paying me more. So keep that in mind. Don't be charging people crazy low rates, because your time is worth something. And while it's admirable to offer friends and family a discount, you also need to consider that what you're doing is actually, valuable. And if they didn't have you as an option, they would be paying someone else their rate anyway. So yeah, that's a tricky one. I've definitely struggled with this in the past, but I think I've got a really good idea of what that looks like now. Okay, so if you just experienced a slight cut, it's because I realized that the numbers that I'm talking about really don't make sense to talk about. If you want, send me a DM and just say, this is where I am, this is the work I'm doing, does this even qualify for the sort of work that you're doing? And if so, I can probably weigh in on that and say, hey, this is what I would cost us that. I don't care. I'm happy to share my rate. I just realized as I was discussing it then that it really doesn't matter what I say or like what numbers I give, whether they're ballpark or not, because it just won't apply to anyone else. My rates will probably change in a year anyway. My rates really depend on where I am in the UK as well. So, if I'm costing a project that's based in Cardiff, where I live, it's probably going to be much lower than a project if it was in Manchester or Birmingham, London, anywhere else in the UK, because those cities will obviously have different rates because there's different ceilings in different parts of the UK. So yeah, it's really difficult to discuss this openly because I don't want to provide information that just doesn't make sense. I want to be transparent with people, but it would just be silly. So I'm not going to discuss specifics. Let's just talk about the actual types of rate that I charge, and hopefully that will make sense to people and they can weigh up in their head where they're at, right? So my lowest rate is for family and friends, and it's based on my middle rate, but slightly reduced. Okay, so my middle rate. This will be easier to talk about. My middle rate is my go-to. This is the rate that I often refer to when I get new potential projects, potential clients who approach me if they say, we've got this project. This is the rate that I will, by default, go back to. And the way that I calculate this rate is how much money did I want to earn in a year? So take that number and then figure out how many days in a year you expect to be working. Take that big number, divide it by the amount of days that you actually consider yourself to be working. There you go. That's essentially how you figure out a day rate. Obviously, it's a very short version of it. But yeah, it's as simple as that. Now, there are other considerations. What's the average rate in your area? Ask people. There's nothing wrong with approaching people who are doing something very similar to you and just seeing what the average industry benchmark is. What do they charge? Now, not all of them are probably going to be honest with you, but it'll probably give you a good indicator of where other people are at, because you also don't want to be charging too little compared to other people or too much, because if you're charging too little, people may not have confidence in you as an individual. They might think, something's not right there. Or if you're charging too much, they may just look at other options without even considering your offer, right? But this is the one that I often go to. It makes sense for me, and it's based on trial and error, honestly. So if there's a project that I really don't fancy, if it's not really for me, I might try to push my rate slightly higher, maybe like 10, 20%. And if they say yes, I know that there's still potential for me to sort of play with my day rate, right? Because as discussed, I operate on a day rate. If I find that a lot of people are saying no, then obviously I've gone a little bit too far and I need to rein that back in. But here in Cardiff, I've got a pretty good understanding of where the rates are. But again, it's such a variance that it would be pointless for me to even discuss it openly, because who knows, 2 months down the line, it's probably going to change anyway, but we'll see. Anyway, so the last rate that you should have prepared is your highest rate. Now, this should be reserved for larger clients. Think, public sector organizations or large established brands. These are the clients that you can charge a premium to because they're probably used to it, right? If they're used to working with really large agencies that demand stupidly high fees, or if they're working with crazy budgets, then your day rates probably won't be a drop in the ocean for them. But you need to be sensible with this. You can't just add a zero onto the end of your rates and just be like, cool, off we go. You need to establish whether that makes sense in the context of what you're actually providing. And yeah, most of the time you'll find that these organizations will have a higher budget when it comes to working with people. And yeah, you can leverage that, honestly. So I'm trying to think of an example for this. Public sector usually works really well for this, which, anything to do with the government or local council, just because they operate on higher budgets. And yeah, like I said, large established brands. Don't be afraid to approach them because they do have massive budgets. And if you could see the amount that they were spending on their marketing every year, you wouldn't believe it. So yeah, definitely have those 3 rates in mind and base your pricing on those. Yeah, pretty much it. Yeah, so I hope that all made sense. It got a little bit scrappy at the end there. I find that as I get through these podcasts, it definitely gets harder to sort of articulate exactly what I'm trying to put out there. For the most part, these podcasts are unscripted. I have talking points next to me here, but they're not very detailed, and I usually just sort of discuss things, off the top of my head. But yeah, if there was anything that wasn't clear and you want further clarification, by all means, reach out to me on Instagram or wherever. I'm always happy to help. I'm very transparent with people. The only reason why I didn't discuss my specific rates is because, like I said, it just wouldn't make sense to. it changes all the time. It changes on the client. It changes on location. So me sharing my rate right now just wouldn't make sense. So yeah, if you want to know that rate, just send me a DM. More than happy to share it. And yeah, hopefully everything else I've said will help steer you to make a good decision on how you structure your pricing when clients approach you or vice versa. And yeah, I hope that this was all valuable. This is definitely the sort of conversation that I wish I'd had when I first started out, because as I just said, I really didn't have a clue. So yeah, awesome. That was a nice little episode, but I'm going to wrap it up there. My next episode will probably be on selling, or maybe even, structuring or approaching clients and how, to actually manage your day-to-day when it comes to running a business. But more on those things soon. Hopefully pricing we covered in depth enough today. Yeah, see you in the next one.